Greetings and welcome to the fourth class of the fourth semester of the Emerald Choral Academy. I am Gary Cannon, the artistic director of the Emerald Ensemble, which is a professional choir based in Seattle. The Emerald Choral Academy is a series of interactive webinars during which our area's leading professional choristers reveal their personal tricks of the trade to community singers. These webinars are then made available freely to singers across the world via YouTube. The Emerald Ensemble wishes to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish tribe, past and present, and we aim to honor with gratitude the land and the life itself of the Duwamish people. This presentation is funded in part by a grant from the Washington State Arts Commission, in addition to the National Endowment for the Arts, For Culture, the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, and many generous donors. We acknowledge anyone participating or viewing this webinar to make a donation as you are able at emeraldensemble.org. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and join our mailing list to hear about future sessions of the Academy and the other activities of the Emerald Ensemble. This webinar is being recorded. By participating, you are granting the Emerald Ensemble permission to share your contribution. Your microphones and cameras will remain off for the duration of the presentation. You can, however, ask questions to the presenter by typing into the chat or Q&A features at the bottom of your screen. And then periodically, I will interject to field your questions. Today's presenter is the esteemed baritone Ryan Bede. Ryan is deeply beloved by Pacific Northwest opera audiences. Recently, though, he moved to Central Tennessee, and while he taught here at several colleges in the Seattle area, so we still consider him more or less a local, and is now ABD at one of our universities here also. But now Ryan teaches at Lipscomb University in Nashville. I have sung with Ryan, I've conducted him, and he's always a charm and a pleasure and truly the consummate musician. Our topic today is Vocal Anatomy 104, the Pharynx. Thank you, Ryan Bede.
Certainly. Good afternoon for me. Good morning for you. I'm so happy to be here with you today to further our series on the anatomy of the human voice. We began this series several seasons ago with several different presenters now. And my hope today is to take us one step further in a systematic approach, to put a term on it, to the makeup and building of the vocal mechanism. So I'm going to go ahead and take a moment here and share my screen so I can show you my slideshow. Oh, I think I am disabled from sharing my screen. Gary or Scott, would you mind giving me permission to?
You should be able to do that now. I'm so glad that we.
Okay, good. I'm so glad that we're doing that. Great. Okay. Here we are, ready. So the systems of the voice. Let me begin for just a quick moment and say that like any other musical instrument, there needs to be several different components to any musical instrument. Number one, some sort of generator or power source. Where does the impetus to make the sound come from originally? It needs a way to generate the sound, or some place to vibrate. Something to come together. Think of the lips for a trumpet player, the bow on the string for a string player, hand hitting a piano key, that the hammer hitting the string, the vibration of a reed with a woodwind instrument, blowing across the top of a flute, not unlike blowing the top of a bottle. All of these things are how is the vibration of the sound beginning. And then third, what we are discussing today is the idea of resonance. There has to be a way for the sound to be repeated and amplified in order to bring music out into the air and into our awareness. The human voice has two other systems that are not shared by all musical instruments, one of which we talked about quite at length with the last vocal anatomy presentation, and that is one of registration. Just a little review there. We talked about the two major muscles in the larynx that dominate the two registers or modes. Mode 1, a full or chest register. Mode 2, a falsetto head register. The Mode 1 muscle in charge is the thyroarytenoid. The Mode 2 muscle in charge is the cricothyroid. And that determines certain aspects of the source sound. That word source will become very familiar and very important to you today, so hold on to that. And the other system that's unique to the voice, because no other instrument uses the mouth like we do, is the way that the vocal sound is articulated. Scott and Gary and I were just talking a few moments ago about where the way forward after Vocal Academy 104, it certainly will include a presentation on articulation in the future. So please stay with us, in the future and watch for that. Articulation, of course, is accomplished on other musical instruments by moving various fingers around, the three valves on a trumpet. You may notice I make brass instrument references often. I'm a reformed trumpet player, as I often like to say. But the articulatory system finishes the vocal process. Okay? And I want to call your attention for a moment to this word that I've used in the articulator description, saying that it interrupts vowel sounds. So we're going to be talking lots today about prolonging a tone, right? And when we're talking about prolonging a vocal tone, we're talking about extending a vowel sound. So today's about vowels. We'll hit on consonants in future sessions together. All right, moving right along, I'd like to talk a little bit about what exactly do we mean by the vocal tract. Today's title is the pharynx. It's the next region up from the larynx, and the pharynx, as I've developed my presentation and methodology, is in some ways a subset of the vocal tract. So let me just take a few moments and give us a orientation to what we mean when we talk about the vocal tract. I hope you all had a chance to get a hold of the handout for today, and maybe there will be some more bullet points of clarity that you can take with you if any of this needs further explanation. So talking about the length of the vocal tract and landmarks starting from the larynx, right above the laryngeal space, right above the superior aspect of the vocal folds that we talked about at length the last time. We're talking about the region from there to the edge of the lips. So all the way out from the larynx out into the air, we're talking about that being the length of the vocal tract. Now, as is the case with many things pertaining to the voice, so much is dependent on slight differences in human anatomy. No two voices are the same, no two larynges or pharynges are quite the same, but if we take some scientific data, some medical data that has been extensively researched, we find that the average vocal tract length for male human being is about 17 centimeters, and the average length of the vocal tract for a female human being is about 14 centimeters. Those two measurements will have bearing on the types of sound that is produced. Just a little taster tidbit there. The larger the tract, the lower frequencies are amplified. Now I'm sure that comes as no surprise. Most male voices are pitched a certain amount lower than a similar sample size of female voices, and some of that pertains to the length of the tube. Think about now the difference between a trumpet, a trombone, a French horn, and a tuba. We have different lengths and different pitch characteristics. I don't want to get too far off track here, so I'll just go right on forward and say that all the sounds that the vocal folds generate, they have to pass through the vocal tract before we can perceive them through our hearing. There is a really, really fascinating video that I will be sure to share with Gary and Scott so they can share with you of some research that was done on raw laryngeal source sound. I didn't get to sort of insert it in the presentation today, but it's interesting for our ears to hear what would this sound be like if it were not amplified or changed by the vocal tract. The word resonate at its etymology and breaking the word down literally means to resound. So in order to complete the sound that we hear when one speaks or sings, we need both the source of the sound, the larynx, and the filter of the sound, the vocal tract. Okay, so the vocal tract is unique that it really has involvement in two systems. You can say that it's tied to the digestive system or to the respiratory system, and the gateway there is one that we have examined a little bit in past lectures. But the two pathways would be one towards the stomach through the esophagus, or into the trachea past the epiglottis towards the lungs. So we're talking about, when we talk about the vocal tract, we're talking about a anterior to the cervical spine and to the spine as a whole. That's an important thing to mention because we're going to talk lots today about the space inside the vocal tract and inside the pharynx. One place that we cannot physically change or alter or increase or decrease the space is that through the spinal column. That is bone and other tissue that is not, it's not expandable. There are certain aspects of flexibility, but not expandability. I want to call your attention for just a moment here. I think you can probably see me sort of circling with my mouse, that this diagram shows air passageway. It's important to note that the pharynx and the vocal tract in general is naturally an air-filled space. So let's just take a moment here and close your mouth and take a nice deep breath in through your nose and out. Now take a nice deep breath in through your mouth without plugging your nose. Right, we're moving air, unless you're experiencing allergy symptoms, as some are at this time of year. Hopefully that air flowed very freely when you took those two breaths. When there are instances that fluid is present in these cavities, our sensation of our singing and the resonance that is produced will be altered. Okay? So moving on to the pharynx itself. We're talking about a tube of tissue that's muscular in nature. We have sort of three levels of constrictor muscles, three parts of the pharynx that can be constricted to produce different effects. And these three parts are known as the nasopharynx or nose pharynx, oropharynx, the mouth pharynx, and the laryngopharynx, or the pharynx in the area of the larynx. This is also referred to in some publications as the hypopharynx. Pardon me. Hypo being low, hyper being high. We'll talk about some things like hyponasality as opposed to hypernasality as we go on today. But this just gives you an idea of roughly where we're looking at this drawing. This is the larynx here, or the vocal folds. So you see that the colors are representative there. Just a few more landmarks here. This is the tongue. This is the soft palate right here, otherwise known as the velum. This is the hard palate. This is the maxilla, okay? And we have a particularly detailed drawing of the tongue here, which I really love because that striation in the muscle there gives us a clue as to just how strong that tongue muscle is. We're going to be talking today some about how we can become a bit more in charge, a bit more of the master or mistress of what our tongue's doing while we're trying to sing, and what the effect on the tone can be. All right, so onward we go. You've now heard me say these words, source and filter, several times. So the larynx itself is responsible to create, vibrate the tone, and also to be the source of registration. Like I said a few moments ago, that is dependent upon which muscles are in charge. We'll sort of harken back to the last session and say that, there are more muscles in the larynx, of course, other than just the TA and CT muscles. We need muscles to draw the folds together and apart. We need, the other movements of the vocal folds. It's not just those two muscles, but when we're talking registration, that's the main terms that we'll be hearing. This is important. So without the resonance and articulation systems, which we're talking about, those two together make up the vocal tract. The sound would only be a fundamental tone. You would hear a raw, buzzy sound that would be intelligible at a certain pitch. That's what we're talking about when we say the word frequency. We'll come back to to this term several times over the course of the next half hour or so, but a number that always rings in our awareness as musicians is A440, the A above middle C, A4 with the octave numbers, and that 440 means that there are 440 hertz, 440 revolutions. That is the frequency of that sound. Okay, but the fundamental tone, this bit of detail here and quote from Karen Wicklund come from a fantastic book on singing voice rehabilitation, an area that I'm very interested in myself and have developed as some of my working with singers. But without resonance, the sound would lack richness, appeal, and most importantly, probably intelligibility. What is it that this sound is supposed to mean to us, to our ears when we hear it? Karen Wicklund shares that manipulations of the vocal tract provide beauty, definition, and stylistic versatility in singing sound. So these are three things that as singers, whether we're singing in a small chamber choir or a large community orchestra and chorus, or a mass choir gathered over low latency internet gatherings like have happened over the last several years due to the necessity of the pandemic. We all of us as singers desire to create richness, appeal, intelligibility, beauty, definition, and stylistic versatility. All of us want to be able to sing and be convincing in different languages, different styles, different in likeness to some of our favorite performers. I don't know how many karaoke singers out there are, but that's something that we certainly strive for in that arena. So the well-trained singer can use the vocal tract and various shaping techniques and strategies to create classical sound, music theater sound, and also commercial. And by commercial, we're involving things like pop and jazz and rock and all of these other genres. For a very long time, CCM, contemporary commercial music, was the language in vogue. Contemporary vocal styles, commercial vocal styles, have certainly made their way as some new language for that. So when we say commercial, that's kind of where we're going with that. So sometimes we can actually help registration changes, help them along their way by using vowel modification. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. But this next thing is something that's very particularly important. We want to create ring, ping, squillo, twang, all these other, these words that kind of bring to our minds terms like pop. Where does the vocal sound really come alive? At varying pitches and with varying types of resonance strategy. Okay. So when we're talking about fundamental frequency and harmonics, today is supposed to be a sort of an introductory dive into the resonances of the vocal tract and the sounds produced at the folds. But harmonics are the first of two very, very important things that we want to understand. So a little bit of more information harkening back to our phonation time together. The frequency of the vocal folds, just like a guitar or piano string, is governed by the length and tension of the vocal folds and the air pressure that is provided. We use that word pressure, it can sometimes have more than a bit of negative connotation, I would say, but we do need air energy, air support, air pressure to set the vocal folds in motion. I talked to you all last time about the vibration and oscillation of the vocal folds is dependent upon both aerodynamics and a myoelastic effect, a muscle stretching and opening and closing effect. So a longer, thinner string, even for you non-guitarists, think about the lowest and the highest string on your guitar. Both of those, if it's tuned in the conventional way, are sounding the pitch E, Mi on the fixed-O scale, but the octave is different. Okay, so the basic theory of a difference in octave is a double of frequency. So if you go from C1 to C2, the frequency is doubled. If you go from G3 to G4, the frequency is doubled. And the fold or string would be half as wide, half as of its volume, and twice as tight, right? To use those words. So where this goes one step further for us today is that we need to figure out a way to develop that sound from its raw data, so to speak, computer scientists out there, into the final product. Now, we have areas in our body where our voices resonate. And I'm going to stop for a second and call back to when we were talking registration. I used the word chest and I used the word head. We've heard voice teachers, conductors, coaches, read it in academic material, wherever we've encountered head voice, chest voice, voce di petto, voce di testa. It goes all the way back to all kinds of, wonderful European research several centuries back. But when we talk about head voice and chest voice, we're kind of talking about, in certain ways, the sympathetic vibrations that we feel in our body. The idea of placing your voice or focusing your voice to a certain part of the body is not really possible. If I can help sort of dispel a question here or bust a myth, is that we can't produce a certain voice here and another voice here. It's not, they're not located there. The whole mechanism is involved in all of our vocal sounds. one of our principles of today's sharing is that the regions in which the sound is enhanced or amplified helps determine what we're talking about as far as resonant strategy. Okay, so we have a number of vocal resonators that we can use, right? There's the area, below the vocal folds with air exchange. There's a certain amount of of immovable space that's below the folds themselves. As we're in the trachea is a very is a little bit more of a rigid tube, so more of a fixed structure, and that's the first resonating area. We have an area right above the vocal folds, sometimes talked about as the piriform sinus. It's just a laryngeal vault is another way to say this, that is possible to have a little bit of a resonant space. And then we move into the pharynx, which we've talked about several times already this hour, and how it has its three parts: laryngopharynx, oropharynx, and nasopharynx. For our purpose of my little bullet point on 7 vocal resonators, that just sort of counts for 1, because we're still left with the oral cavity itself, the nasal cavity itself, and to a certain extent, the sinus cavities. Now, I want to go back. I'm going to take us back a couple slides here, because I am realizing now that I neglected in my presentation mode to share a few things that I really wanted to drive home to you. So pardon me for backtracking a little bit here, but I wanted to call a little bit of attention to the soft palate. And when we're talking about the pharynx, this is all going to be very important as we talk about resonance strategy, because what's one thing that we have all heard ad nauseum when it pertains to singing is lift that soft palate, right? It should be high, right? Lofted space, rounded vowels, all these sort of things. Insert any catchphrase that you like. But when we're talking about what the soft palate is doing, let's talk a little bit more for a second about what this system does other than singing, right? When we go to swallow something, for example, the soft palate raises, so the food or water or whatever you're having come in through your mouth doesn't also come out an area that you don't want it to, right? So the soft palate lifts and raises to shut off that nasopharyngeal area so things don't come through there, right? And as you look at the back of your own mouth, I've said this several times in past presentations, your cameras are off, so you can sort of look into your computer if you want and just kind of track this area, looking at the back of coming down from your nasopharynx into oropharynx. You'll notice your uvula hanging quite unusually and without real purpose at the back of your mouth. That gives you an idea of kind of where your soft palate ends, and you can do a nice experiment in there. Light's not quite bright enough in here for you to see mine, but think about opening your mouth, having a nice low liquid tongue position, and then watching that area back there take that sort of gasp of surprise, and you'll see the uvula go up, and you'll see the pharyngeal space increase quite a bit. Okay, so on the posterior wall of that nasopharynx is where your adenoids are located. I wanted to really include this today because several presentations ago we were talking about vocal emergencies. We were talking about interruptions, scary things that can happen to the voice, and one of those things is pharyngitis, tonsillitis, all these sort of things, and sometimes these structures need to be removed. So knowing that their location pertains very strongly to some resonant considerations is very helpful for us today. So then another word for those adenoids is the pharyngeal tonsil. Okay, now this is something I haven't touched on yet, but it's very, very important. So one other attachment into the nasopharynx is the eustachian tubes from your ears. So the vibration that we hear out of the pharynx through the eustachian tubes into the middle ear is very important for our own sensation of singing, right? Jumping a little bit around here, let me illustrate the point that the sensation and sound of your own voice is, what you hear when you are talking and or singing is different from what you hear when you listen to a recording of yourself. I'm sure I don't have to ask for a show of hands. We would have plenty of people in the room that would say, I hate to hear myself on, someone's answering machine or something like that, because we hear our voice different than what we're used to hearing all day when we talk our heads off. Especially teachers, we do that a lot. And both of those situations are quite different from what someone else hears, something that we can't replicate. And one of the main reasons why we need voice teachers that are trained sets of ears to recognize things that are going on in the voice. Okay, but the eustachian tubes are in charge of helping the eardrums to vibrate properly and give us the right sensation. Okay, so a couple interesting facts about the oropharynx. The middle part of the three, behind the mouth, posterior to the part of the mouth that we see most often. Little interesting fact back there, the way that the mucosa and layers of tissue are structured are actually really not that different from the vocal folds themselves. The name of this type of tissue is stratified squamous epithelium. Lots of medical terms in here. Stratified means that it's in layers, right? Going back to our phonation and larynx lecture, we talked about the epithelial layer on the outside of the vocal folds, and then 3 layers of lamina propria before you get to the vocal ligament and the thyroarytenoid muscle when we're talking about the folds. There's similarly layered tissue in the back of the oropharynx. Another set of part of your tonsil anatomy is found in the oropharynx. That's called the palatine tonsils, and there's a little bit of the tonsils that also extend to and attach to the back of the tongue, and those are what we know as the lingual tonsils. So if you're going to have your tonsils and adenoids removed, or if you did in your childhood, very often all of those are taken away. So if you haven't before, take a moment and just sort of let your mind examine the difference that makes in the vocal tract if those structures are present or absent. I've never had tonsillitis. I've never had the need to have anything removed or operated on or anything, but at my current age and level of experience, to say it that way, as a singer, I certainly would be cautious is not strong enough a word to if the anatomy were to be altered in that way, I would certainly want to have someone who is intimately familiar with the professional voice user do that procedure. And one of those very, very frustrating unknowns is what would the difference be? Could I count on some sort of improvement? Would I have to take a year to relearn how to sing? But one thing is in my mind is definitely certain, is that would be another instance where a set of outside ears would be very, very important. Okay, so the contraction of the oro and laryngopharynx is very important part of the swallowing reflex. There's a very important part of our brain called the medulla that helps us decide to swallow. The pharynx has to constrict. We have to stop the breathing impetus so we don't take food and air down into our stomach and gastric area. We also need the medulla also needs to tell the palate to come up, so the nasopharynx closes off. We need the larynx to come up. We need that epiglottis to close over, and then we need some muscle involvement that brings things down the esophagus and that the term for that is peristalsis. If you've not encountered that before, think about rolling up your toothpaste tube from the bottom, and let's just say for a moment that you're not one of those ones that squeezes the toothpaste tube from the middle, and you actually roll it up from the bottom. You are creating a bit of peristalsis, if you will, for that toothpaste coming through the tube. Okay, onward we go. I would like to move back into our fundamental frequency harmonics. Thank you again for your indulgence as I went back. But as we were talking about resonators, that came back to my mind. I wanted to share that connection in the nasopharynx with you. So
Ryan, would now be a good time for a couple of questions?
Please, absolutely. Thank you so much for interjecting. I would love to have us do a few questions here.
Not a lot, but a couple of things. First of all, I at least never realized how much was involved in swallowing. That's fascinating. You mentioned very briefly the notion of allergies and how all that affects. We singers, we talk about mucus all the time, so this is a common.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, even with people who aren't singers sometimes.
Right.
So how? And this may be something to address later, I don't know.
Sure.
How does that notion of postnasal drip in an allergy situation, how does that affect how you use that musculature in the pharynx while singing?
That's a wonderful question. When we have, I mentioned as on several quick occasions that these are chiefly air-filled spaces, and when we have allergy, inflammation, and all these sort of things, we often have fluid present in air-filled spaces. So that's not only going to create a difference in sensation for us, but if tissues are inflamed and made puffier or larger, you can then kind of take the next step and say that maybe some of that space would be reduced. Right, if you have inflammation in the nasopharynx, maybe as that soft palate encounters the intersection point there, there was some swelling or inflammation there. It's certainly a source of differing sensation. It can absolutely be a source of auditory and acoustical difference. One of my favorite little adages to share with singers when it comes to being affected by allergies, when your ability to say the word mom turns to only the ability to say the name Bob, right? You're talking about having an interruption in a nasal resonating space when we go similarly to an N and an NG. We're using chiefly nasal resonance. So you can't do, your M becomes a B and your N goes to a D, right? So, you're having, and that's just like with many other things when we're talking vocal science, there's many rabbit holes to go down, even just there, that M and B and N and D, and maybe some of you have even heard about, onsetting tones using some of those other consonants to assist with things. But don't want to get too far off topic. To answer your question, allergies, pharyngitis literally means inflammation of the pharynx. Laryngitis means inflammation of the larynx. Now, inflammation of the larynx, laryngitis, is when we're talking about hoarseness. So what you probably will not feel with the pertaining to the pharynx, that's not going to have much to do with hoarse or breathy sound unless we're having interruptions in the palate closing off or something like that. That hopefully answers your question.
Yeah, you mentioned the palate closing off. That brings things from my own vocal training. I remember one instructor who quite wisely tried to ensure that everything was open back there. Mm-hmm. And I found that once I opened things and dropped my tongue as well, and there wasn't any pressure, that's when things just emptied into the back. How do you as a singer deal with that, or how do you recommend?
Well, I think it's a really, really great question, and I'm so glad that you're leading us here, because this is a slide that I didn't include today, but I think it's really important when we think about creating space in the pharynx, and we think about that, gasp of surprise that I was talking about, we have the sensation of vertical and backspace, the inverted megaphone type of thing, being created. But like you just said, it's very easy to have, pushing down from the rear of the tongue, and when pushing down on the tongue means pushing down on the larynx, and artificially mechanically lowering the larynx is going to dampen things in the vocal tract and create some of that swallowed sound, for lack of a better image, when it comes to creating that space. Something that I talk about with singers and speakers alike. I've begun to work with some folks who are not only using their voice to sing, but they're teachers, or they're other public speakers, and they're trying to optimize the way that they use their voice, right? Eliminate some tension, eliminate some entanglements. And one thing that we can do is think about plugging your nose. So now we're going to make the nasal part of our process not part of the equation. And excuse me for my, positioning here. You needed to see my mouth. We're going to go from the middle of the vowel chart, from ah, the most neutral vowel, and you're going to go ah, e, ah, and then you're going to go ah, o, ah. And just everyone just sort of do this. Cameras are off, mics are off. Try to experiment in the way that you're not getting a lot of resistance on your fingers. Ah, e, ah, o, right? And you can even feel as you do that when you're going e, or you can't go e, because that would be hypernasality that I just did. So you will feel that on your fingers if you do this exercise while you do that. So the ideal is for, now we're talking classical vocal sound. We're talking about typical Western classical music here. The current consensus is that a arched but not overly arched palate and a neutrally low larynx is what we're talking about position-wise. For the more commercial or some music theater, especially more contemporary stuff, is a neutrally higher larynx and a neutrally lower palate space. And I said the thing about an inverted megaphone. Think about the big space being at the front in classical sound, and the megaphone being like its normal configuration for more contemporary sound, where we are spreading lips, using more, of awareness of the front for the sensation of those sounds. But going back to the way that you worded your question, it is very easy when thinking about making space that a byproduct can be falling down the throat, and some of that dampening effect is not allowing these pharyngeal spaces to resonate like we want them to when we're talking about harmonics. And in a few moments, when we talk about specifically how a harmonic and a formant are defined and what we can do with that. When we get a super hyper nasal sound, certain things are being dampened while others are being heightened. When we have a darker sound, let's call in the term of chiaroscuro, light versus dark, right? When we have something that's very chiaro, we have the oscuro parts are dampened. When we have something that's more oscuro, we have the chiaro parts that are dampened. And that's one reason why this word chiaroscuro sort of just floats out there in the ether when we talk about making vocal sound, because we all want balance in our vocal sound. We don't, if you're maybe if you're Ethel Merman, your extreme chiaro is really, really important. And there's a whole lot of oscuro in like a James Earl Jones speaking voice or something like that, and not much chiaro, right? but we're looking for a balance of those colors, if you will.
Next question, maybe I hope is a brief one for you here. Sorry.
That's okay.
You talked about what a vocal mechanism would sound like without the resonance or articulation chambers. Are there recordings of that? Have you heard that? What is it?
I have heard this some. If you can, there was a team of scientists that put together some sort of a tone generator that would mimic what vocal sound would be like without the resonance, sort of that our vocal tract adds to it. If you many of us have a tuner on our device or something like that. If you have a battery operated tuner, or maybe on your tablet or something like that, that's kind of a raw without resonance type of sound. That would be some of the closest I would think you could come to just mimicking what raw sound would be like. But again, I will definitely locate that YouTube video and share it so it can be kind of disseminated. That rabbit hole was one I did not find my way to the bottom of the last time that I looked. So,
That's
but
so wild.
But it's out there. It's really fascinating. I love movies, and I really love funny movies. And I can remember a movie where one character says to another, and do you want to hear the most annoying sound in the world? So when I think about raw sound, I wonder how far off from that particular movie or sound that would be. And the fact of the matter is that it would be slightly different for every person, because the varying differences in length of vocal tract, the way the folds are oscillating with each other. Even if I guess we weren't talking about vocal tract when we talk about raw sound, because we're doing it without resonance. But then we have tracheal length. What are the branches of, as you go into the lungs like? What is the fascia of the folds looking like? I mean, I think I'm not reaching too far by saying there would be some variation.
Yeah, very good. All right, thank you. I'll let you keep going.
Sure, absolutely. So I think we left off with the idea of forced versus free resonance. When we're talking about forced resonance, we're talking about things that are fixed surfaces that are connected to the source of the sound. Okay, so the larynx is mechanically connected. The tissue is directly connected to the opening of the trachea, right? If you're at the inferior point of the folds, we're going right into the trachea, right? So the chest, starting with the attachment point of the trachea to the larynx, is a fixed structure. So this is like the soundboard on a piano, or something like that, where the strings are screwed into the soundboard, and that soundboard, while it allows resonance and vibration, it itself does not move. You don't, the soundboard of the piano doesn't go up and down. Our chests don't mechanically go up and down, right? They're fixed cavities. So think about the other fixed places. You have sinus cavities that are sort of impregnated, for lack of a better word. I can't come up with one at the moment, in the middle of a bony structure. So that's another area that's pretty standard and anchored. And the word forced, I like the correlation here. When you force the sound in to a more nasal resonance, right? You're forcing that sinus cavity to take, you're forcing sensation up into that sinus cavity, right? So this is a good way to remember forced resonance. Now, free resonance, free to resound in lots of different ways. This is where we're talking about the flexible structures that we're dealing with today. the pharyngeal structures, the oral cavity, the nasal cavity, using the tongue to change vowels, which we'll be, talking about in several minutes. Free resonance. We want there to be free vocal production. We want there to be free airflow. So we need to concentrate on developing an ability to foster free resonance. Have lots of colors available. Sometimes I talk about, even from a registration standpoint, if your chest voice is red and your head voice is blue, there's a lot of purple that is possible in the spectrum of the notes that you will be singing. We can create a number of different types of sound. Now, I on purpose use that both when talking about phonation and resonance, because by creating those different vocal colors, we're really amplifying certain parts of the vocal tract's vibration and resonance and dampening others, right? When we're talking about lip vowels, O and U, as opposed to tongue vowels, E and A, we're talking about reshaping the vocal tract, resounding, reinterpreting that sound to define other vowels. Okay, so moving right on, harmonics are equally spaced multiples of the fundamental frequency. So I'm sure you all or many of you have been exposed to the harmonic sequence, right? Brass players, this is an excellent correlation. If you're aware of the bugler playing taps is playing on open harmonics that don't require any valves, any changes to the tube. You have an octave above the fundamental, and then there's some thirds and fifths and a false seventh, and you eventually get at some point to the ability to produce successive diatonic steps, which is why some of the Baroque instruments work the way that they do, a valveless trumpet and all these sort of things. But what's important for us, and something that we're going to talk about in just a moment, is the harmonics of a fundamental frequency. Now, we also, so there's, at the risk of not having confusion, we also need to bring the word overtone into the conversation right here, because when we talk harmonics, that's where overtones come in. These are the other things in other pitches in a harmonic sequence that are discernible within a certain pitch. Now, this is really very difficult to quantify when it comes to listening to a singing voice. There are all kinds of computer programs and other things that are out there now. Voce Vista is the name of one. There's a software program called Prot that's used by a lot of speech language pathology professionals to provide, so they call it spectrography, or a spectrogram of what's going on in the resonance of a certain vowel. But knowing that there are harmonics that are able to be produced as multiples of the fundamental frequency, and where it really comes, the rubber really hits the road for us as singers, is when those harmonics are very near formants, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. But I'll emphasize that we're talking frequency and harmonics. Those are source situations, right? The fundamental frequency is originated at the source, or at the larynx, okay? I just threw in a little illustration here at the bottom. The way that we're currently representing these frequencies, it used to be F sub 1, or F sub 2, or F sub 3. You'll see in a moment that there's a little bit of potential for confusion with that in formats. So the way that we're talking about it now is, 2 of fundamental frequency. The fundamental frequency is also known as the first harmonic. So we're talking about double of that frequency. And 880 hertz just happens to be a 5, which is 1 octave above A4. And, your math brain can kind of get going and realize that another octave up would be, 1,760. And then you're into the mid 3000s and into the upper 7000s as you get to the top of the piano keyboard. Some notes there at the top that we haven't been able to reproduce in the human voice as of yet. Although I will say, on the other end, I've been particularly fascinated during the last couple of years with all these people making their home singing videos. Some of the low pitches being produced by a low bass voice, and even some in the subharmonic territory, which is a whole nother rabbit hole for another day. But there's so much possibility for further investigation, and in all ends of the spectrum. Let's move on as we are moving towards our hour here of elapsed time into talking a little bit about formants. So harmonics and fundamental are dealing with the pitch of the sound that you're hearing. The frequency, whether it's high or low note, is dealing with frequency and harmonics. Formants are rather a resonance of the vocal tract. Okay, you can find the sort of default, the default format of a selected vocal tract in a particular human being. I suppose it doesn't have to be a human being. I mean, we know there's animals that sort of sing that are not human, but certainly this information is widely available, but we won't spend too much time doing mathematical calculations. It deals with a measurement of the speed of sound and the length of the vocal tract. It happens to be the speed of sound is a certain number, 350 meters per second or something like that. Scott McCoy in his book Your Voice in Inside View, which is kind of like a Bible when it comes to voice science, a book that I've well worn out. That's the speed that he frequently talks about. If you use the length of the vocal tract, the speed of sound, and several other variables, multiplications and things, we find that somewhere around 500 hertz is the sort of the natural format of a 17.5 centimeter long vocal tract. Set the calculations aside, but for the purpose of that number, 500. So that's a little bit over A440, right? So a little bit over A4 on the piano. Now, I'm a baritone, certainly in my full voice, A4 is a really high pitch, right? That's, so thinking about formants, this is a great way to think about it not being a function of the source or the harmonic or the pitch. It's just keep that in mind, because if the frequency and or harmonics are closely associated with where one of those formats are located, that's where we have a more drastic amplification of sound. So there are a number of different format locations. The first format region is in the throat and pharynx, where we're talking about today. The second format location is in the mouth space. I put in parentheses here the inferior tongue position, right? The back part of the tongue. Gary, you asked this question about burying the sound in the throat. Getting the tongue into its ideal position for these vowels, formation of the vowels, is a format activity. Okay, the tip of the tongue can also have lots of effect on the profile of the sound coming out. There have been several very, very famous singers who have sung for decades and decades and decades who have done some, shall we say, improper or incorrect things with the front of their tongues, and yet managed to make wonderful sound that people pay lots and lots of money to hear. But we try in our study of voice science, functional anatomy, pedagogy of learning effective teaching, to try to disentangle is one of my favorite words when it pertains to optimizing this process. It's all in there already. We have to figure out how to get out of our own way more than a lot of things. There are a lot of things that we can do with our tongue, our jaw, any number of other structures that are dampening where we want to enhance, and maybe enhancing some of those things that we would really do better to dampen. Okay, so we have an increased vocal tract length. I said that in the beginning. the formant numbers will decrease. Okay, so the first formant will be a lower number. It's a higher number in a higher voice. Leggero tenor as opposed to a bass. A coloratura lyric soprano as opposed to the rare and sought after contralto voice. There's going to be some differences, probably in tract length, fold anatomy, all kinds of different things that are going to create this difference in pitches. But these are quantifiable measurements, that an increased vocal tract length decreases the formant numbers, that a decreased vocal tract length increases the formant numbers. And when we have lips spreading or lips rounding, we can make a generalization, say that there's a lot more lip spreading in some of the music theater and contemporary commercial styles than there is in classical singing, where we look for rounded, tall vowels, all kinds of things like that when talking about classical sound. Also, where you're having constriction also has a lot of effect on where the formant numbers are found. Now, before we are done today, I wanted to share some things with you. So you might have to kind of lean in here a little bit. I know we're having some presentations on International Phonetic Alphabet as well, and I think the first one of those happened already. So hopefully some of you will have seen that, and when you see up in the upper left corner here this double E, we're talking about the phonetic symbol lowercase I, E as in beat. Okay, when you go down one here, we're this ah. I usually put AH. That sort of makes us think ah, as in father, or if you're going to the brighter version, Boston ah, like pak the ka, all that sort of thing. That's actually the middle one there. As you go to AH ah, we're talking more father. Okay, go across, we're going towards like something I ought to be doing. This is the open ah, right? And then we move to an O as in boat. And on the upper right corner of my chart, it's oo, okay, as in boot, okay? So you can see the relative tongue positions for E. We've got the front behind the bottom teeth. This is something I'd like you to really notice of all these vowel positions. We want that tip of the tongue to be resting comfortably and in a rather liquid fashion right at the base of the bottom teeth. Now, remember a few moments ago, I talked about that third formant in the tip of the tongue. You think you might dampen some things if you pulled the tip of the tongue back, if that was supposed to be a formant location? You bet, you absolutely would. Okay, so you can notice some differences in pharyngeal space. For E, we have some more concentrated area here, that there's much less of it here for oo, right? But we also have some difference in this part of the pharynx for oo that is not there for E. Okay, if we look at a nice neutral, let's look in the ah family down here. We seem to have lots of space. In fact, we look to have the most space here. Okay, on the right here, the right set of charts are the locations of formants for certain vowels. Okay, so I want to take a few moments before we're finished, and I'd like to take some more questions from you to do a little activity. Okay, so first we're going to talk about the first formant, the pharyngeal throat area formant. So if you open your mouth slightly and you close your glottis. By closing your glottis, I mean don't let any air in and out. We're not going to breathe in and out. We're just going to kind of go, right? There's a little, like, I like to tell my singers to go like, huh, huh, right? Okay. So you're going to do a little glottal closure. And then you can do this on your neck. Ken Bozeman at Lawrence University, prolific author, one of our genius contributors to the field of vocal acoustics, has a lot of this that he does on the side of his neck. But as I was practicing this and recording it a little bit, I find that it's a little bit easier to hear on the cheek here. So open your mouth a little bit, close the glottis, and then you're going to kind of practice hitting on the side of your mouth. And I want you to go E, A, A, O, U, but just like this. right? And I want you to sense what the difference is in what you hear. Right? And look at the frequency numbers. This first peak, the left peak, is the first formant, right? When we're talking about the left and right axis, we're talking about frequency, height or depth of the pitch. The left axis is decibel, is loudness of the pitch. You might be able to discern a little bit less loudness for ah, right? You heard some peaks there in O and U, right? Right? They have kind of a different sound profile, okay? So the first formant, that's a nice illustration of that. Now the second formant, the next peak, okay? We have a peak here, a little to the right of 2000 for E, a little bit to the left of 2000 for A, closer to 1200 for Ah. We're down like 800 for O, and it goes up a little bit for U, but it's such a minuscule difference. We'll call those about the same. Now, if we're going to talk about illustrating the second formant, okay, now we're in the mouth. So I want you to whisper. And now go back and put your eyes on those second peaks. Did you feel it? Go down, down, and kind of stay the same. This is a format chart from Dr. Scott McCoy's book. This is one of my favorite activities to do with singers and speakers when I'm first introducing some of this concept to them, because we haven't made a single singing sound. We haven't even gone E, A, Ah, O, U, and we certainly haven't gone E, A, Ah, O, right? We haven't done any of that stuff. We've just merely smacked the area where the formant is sounding, and then we've talked about inside the mouth, the difference, right? You're kind of just going, and the only interruption of that are the vowel shapings, are right? Okay, so even without making any pitched sound, we can talk formants. And that there is your proof that formants are resonances independently of the vocal tract itself, separate from harmonics and fundamental frequency of the tone in its original form. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to share with you was just some of these resources. Okay, so I mentioned a quote from Karen Wickland's book, which I don't have on this list. I will need to go back and amend this. But these are some of the other fantastic resources that I would highly suggest you look at if you would like to have some more explanation on things that we've talked about today. Maribeth Bunch's book, The Dynamics of the Singing Voice. There's a recent book that deals with Maribeth Bunch Damey's teaching that is actually authored or edited, co-edited by one of our own local Washington State voice teachers, Cynthia Vaughn, in the eastern part of our state. She knew Maribeth personally. So while I don't have that title on this list, that would be a name to search. This next one by Theodore Diamond. This is a great book of lots of pictorial representations of anatomical structures and some of the actions within the vocal tract. This book, I get no referral bonus, I get no commission, but if you like good pictures, this is one of the books that you should have in your library. It's not very expensive. It's available lots of places. For those who really would like to have a deep dive, I cannot recommend these following two resources strongly enough. Your Voice in Inside View, it's now in its third edition from 2019. Dr. McCoy's work goes on and on and on and on. He's continually contributing to journals and all these sort of things. So the information in this volume is very, very much current, state of the art, state of the science. And then Dr. Kari Reagan, who I've been very, very fortunate to work with personally for some time now, contributes her book, A Systematic Approach to Voice, The Art of Studio Application. I've heard many talk about this book as kind of the companion to Dr. McCoy's book, in the way that there's lots of, Dr. Reagan shares lots of teacher takeaways, she calls them, and exercises for isolating the independence and also interdependence of the various vocal systems. It wasn't by accident that I used that word system at the beginning. It all came from her. And then Karen Wickland's book on singing voice rehabilitation also belongs on this list. And if you are interested or already invested in commercial or more contemporary styles, The Vocal Athlete, Marcy Rosenberg and Wendy LeBourne's book that has now had several editions, is another great resource for the reading. And before we take some questions, which I would love to hear, anything that's come to your mind, I just really want to thank the Emerald Choral Academy, the Emerald Ensemble, Gary and Scott, for all that you contribute to our choral community in the Pacific Northwest and to the choral world at large by sharing these presentations over YouTube and allowing people to tune in from anywhere in the world that they so desire. The contribution that you make and that we make together. At the risk of sounding cliche, I don't even mind. We are making the vocal world a better place to be in our own small way by doing these presentations, spreading this information that has been sort of shared with us and improved as time goes on. One of the frustrations, but also beauties of vocal science is that, almost as soon as we can fully explain the last phenomenon that was discovered, a whole new one is coming right behind it down the pipe to further inspire us to the next thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think I've been fascinated to learn how quickly the true science of singing and of how the voice functions has just blossomed in the last 5 years or so.
Oh yes.
It's really fast. It's truly a science, as you're saying. You answer one question and it evolves into three more or what have you. Thank you. And thank you for your kind words about the Emerald Choral Academy. I neglected at the start to acknowledge Scott Kovacs, who's here with us, the executive director of the Emerald Ensemble. He's the visionary who devised this notion when COVID started and everyone was asking, what do we do? And we thought, well, let's help the world learn how to sing better.
Right.
So here we are.
Yeah, a better and more forward way. We're so fortunate, and the attention to some of the precautions that we're taking over the last couple of years, we hope has helped to get us to arrive at the place we are now, where we're seeing more in-person singing being done together again. I know there's certainly a big part of all of our beings was missing in varying degrees, and in certain ways is, with it still kind of hanging over our heads, is, in ways still there. But presentations like the ones that you have facilitated through the Emerald Choral Academy have been a very strong champion for keeping our collaboration together and moving our art forward.
That's the goal. Thank you. I just have one quick question about that penultimate slide where where you had the tongue position, and each one for each position there were 3 different lines. There tend to be a darker line and a middle and then a lighter. What's the significance of
well, I think that it's let me go back and I can share this one more time, and it will be obvious.
We should make this a quick answer too. I see we're over our time.
No, and it's totally fine. It's totally fine.
That's the one. Yes.
I think that. Oops, no. This one. Okay, so it's the look at the bottom at the ah, the ah vowels here. the hard line, the most bold line, is where the tongue is actually sitting for those vowel spots. You see in the difference between the E and the ah, those two lines are essentially reversed. In the E box in the upper left, the actual position of the not very front of the tongue, but the sort of mid blade of the tongue is up. E, right? A. If you go, here's a nice.
So and the real question then is, what about those other lines? What do they mean?
I think that they show the sort of the progression up into that space, if that makes sense. Like, how do you make the journey from neutral tongue position into that? Like, how do we go? We're bringing arching the tongue forward. Does that answer your question?
I think so. Yeah. Now that I'm seeing more fully how the three in the left and the three in the right, the lines are almost in the same position. It's just comparing in a way.
This particular drawing doesn't really show is the influence of the lips on O and U.
Right.
If we had some frontal pictures, which I certainly, we're, like you said, we want to be good stewards of people's time, showing the front space, ah, o, u. We see a difference here. Ah, e, we can see an interior tongue difference, and that's a microcosm of why we say tongue vowels versus lip vowels. By looking at this one picture, it's difficult to by having this sort of sagittal view, we don't get the full complement of that.
Yeah, no, good. Yeah, and I think I'm gonna have like red welts on the side of my mouth all day now, just from constantly.
Believe me, I was trying to make, and there's some fantastic videos of Ken Bozeman teaching. Oh, that's another book that by all means belongs on that list. We talked about doing acoustics next. That's when we can talk about Ken Bozeman's work, but he deals with all kinds of things, and his kind of whooping of his neck is without peer. He really can make all those things happen. I just found I was, for myself, hearing E, A, A, U a lot better when I did it on my cheek. Yeah. But yes, I think we all have sort of a
mouth massage
hazards there of the.
This is great. Thank you for this wonderfully informative production. Thank you to those who asked questions and participated in many ways. This was fantastic. The next offering of the Emerald Choral Academy will take place on, did I write down the date? I don't have the date here in front of me. I have a date in April. I know that's wrong. I'll ask Scott to look that up, and so it is. Ryan had mentioned we're having a few on the International Phonetic Alphabet. That will be one. Michael Bennett will teach that. We're starting a series there. He's a linguist as well as a musician. Everyone will be sure to learn all kinds of helpful tips on diction. This time will be IPA 102. Consonants,
yes.
Ooh, Scott, do you have a date for that?
Saturday, June 18th.
June 18. Thank you very much. June 18th. All of us at the Emerald Ensemble, we're grateful for the enthusiasm of you, our audiences and supporters. As the Emerald Choral Academy continues, you can help to support these efforts by donating at emeraldensemble.org. Also, please do let us know of topics that you would like us to discuss in the future. We are currently in the state of planning our 5th semester, which is exciting. We never thought this would continue quite that long, but we're in need of more ideas. We're starting to run out, so we call upon your interests and needs as well. In the meantime, I'm Gary Cannon. On behalf of Ryan and Scott and all the Emerald Ensemble, I wish you good physical, mental, and musical health. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.